Want to hear your conversation with Leslie after the show? Go to lesliemarshallshow.com/members.
Hey there, America. I'm Leslie Marshall. Mark Taylor-Canfield is our guest. He's an independent journalist from the great city of Seattle. His blogs are posted at the Daily Kos and the Huffington Post. His articles have been published by the Seattle Times, truthout.org, Counterpunch, and Alternet. Mark is also a reporter for Free Speech Radio News on the Pacifica radio network. Also a musician, currently working on a book about the history of the Occupy Wall Street movement. He's been on the show a number of times before. He's been very informative. He also helps us behind the scenes, often with Facebook and things like that, and links and research. He's been awesome like that. Mark, thank you for joining us. More than a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Good evening. How you doing?
Hi, Leslie. Good to talk to you again.
And good to talk to you again. The United States, according to Reporters Without Borders, ranked 32nd in the World Press Freedom Index. Let's talk about that. In a country where we sing "Let Freedom Ring," in a country where we claim our military are dying and fighting for our freedom, in a country that has a constitution and such freedoms as the First Amendment, 32, I mean, we're not even in the top 10. That's pretty abysmal.
Yes, well, we were actually not even in the, well, actually we were in the top 20 until a couple of years ago. I think we were rated about 19th. But, you know, this is according to the Reporters Without Borders, which is a international advocacy group for journalists around the world. I mean, they work with people in places like Syria and Bahrain and Nepal, where, you know, reporters are not only being censored, but are actually being imprisoned and some of them being killed. So it's a very serious group, you know, that's been supporting freedom of speech around the world. And according to their website, the World Press Freedom Index, yeah, we're number 32. And to just give the audience and you, Leslie, an idea of where the context is, and that they actually had cited the arrests and harassment of reporters during the Occupy Wall Street movement protests as one of the reasons for the slip from, I think, about 19th to 27th. And then, of course, this year we have the story about the Associated Press reporters being surveilled by government agencies. So you add that together, and that has contributed to the slip to 32nd. What I need to qualify in saying this is that Reporters Without Borders is not claiming that the United States has a state-run media, which is something that you will find in a lot of other countries around the world where there basically is no press freedom. What they're saying is that in the United States, because of the mistreatment of reporters and the lack of real good investigative journalism on the part of a lot of newspapers who have slashed staffs, you know, to the bone and just don't have local reporters covering local stories anymore. And then also this corporate media consolidation, which has been going on for years, which the Republicans on the FCC have always pushed, you know, this idea that one corporation should be able to own most of the media.
Well, I want to get to that because I'm glad that you brought that up because you were reading my mind. I want to get to that in a minute so that people understand. Third year running, you have Finland as numero uno, the country that most respects media freedom, and that followed by the Netherlands and Norway. First of all, in the past, because you talked about how we've slipped, we were in the top 20 and we no longer are. In the past, most the ranking of most countries, according to, you know, the information that, you know, my crew found and gave to me today for research, is no longer attributable to dramatic political developments, right? You know, and I mean, when you look at what's happened around the world with the Arab Spring and other protest movements, Egypt and other countries, perhaps that is a good idea. So when we get back, let's talk about how the criteria has changed, what Finland, the Netherlands, and Norway, or just Finland, has that the U.S. doesn't, and then let's talk about those corporations that own or are trying to own and buy out a lot of America's media, which means they're heavily trying to buy influence over the American people, not just your consumerism, but your voting, obviously. We'll be back to you. We'll be back to our guest, and if you want to join us, 888-6-LESLIE, Mark Taylor-Canfield.
Get where you want, when you want. The Leslie Marshall Podcast. Go to lesliemarshallshow.com/members.
Hey there, America. I'm Leslie Marshall. Welcome or welcome back. Only true democracy and talk radio. Speaking of welcome back, we welcome back Mark Taylor-Canfield, independent journalist from Seattle. His blog's posted many places like the Daily Kos and the Huffington Post. And he's been on the show, like I said. He's also writing a book on the history of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Mark, thanks for holding Welcome Back. We're talking about the United States being ranked 32nd World Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders. And before the break, I was asking you, Mark, about how the ranking has changed, the criteria has changed, because they won't attribute dramatic political developments to a country. If that's the case, obviously this past year, I think Egypt would certainly win with regard or with regard to the covering of that, because, just by social networking. But why did that change? And did that change? Obviously, that change did affect the United States, dropping from the top 20 to where it is now to 32, right?
I think so. I mean, you have a lot of countries right now that are having sort of an explosion in press freedom that traditionally haven't. And then also other countries who maybe in the past, which, by the way, the United States is pretty much the original country that adopted press freedom. I mean, it had been talked about in Europe and other places, but before Thomas Paine, there really wasn't much press freedom, and the United States traditionally stood in the forefront in that, and that's what the First Amendment is all about, which is why it's a concern to me, being a reporter in the United States, that we've slipped so far. So it's an important issue for reporters for several reasons. I have to say that last year I actually won a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Washington State Patrol for illegally detaining and banning me from the state capitol building, where I was covering sit-ins inside the state capitol rotunda. There were also sit-ins inside the governor's office, and about 7,000 labor union guys and girls outside marching, and that had to do with standing in solidarity with Wisconsin in 2011 and trying to stop all of the budget cuts in our state, in Washington State. So Judge Bryan actually sided with me and said that that was a violation of the First Amendment and press freedom when you make it difficult for reporters to cover an event. Now, here in Seattle, we just had a situation where Dominic Holden, who's an editor for a local weekly newspaper called The Stranger, was harassed by police. He's claiming that one of them actually threatened to come to his work at The Stranger and harass him. And that was because he was trying to cover the arrest of someone on the street, or at least some kind of police action. And there's this typical response in the U.S. where suddenly the law enforcement authorities will close down a 2-block area and not allow any press anywhere near to cover it. So that's one of the issues that I've dealt with. But it's a good sign, that a federal U.S. judge sided with me and the First Amendment, saying that that's not appropriate. I think that's one of the issues that we have going on in the United States. I do think, though, that social media is really, really on the forefront of cutting-edge journalism in the United States as well now, and maybe is not quite as appreciated in this country at the moment, but is doing a lot of really good things to try to help break stories. And then there's folks like Dan Frumkin over at the Huffington Post, who's done some really amazing work on government surveillance through filing FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, and just posted something on Twitter about 40 minutes ago about some of the other issues that have to do with the internal workings of some of the news agencies. I mentioned that a lot of news agencies, a lot of newspapers obviously have closed their doors, but the ones that are still open have cut their reporting staff to the bone. So there's just not enough reporters out there to cover the stories. And then there are internal issues of reporters wanting to cover stories and then having editors and publishers decide that it's either too controversial or, that's just not an issue that they want to cover at their particular publication. So there's a sort of internal censorship that goes on. There's no one from the government or any corporate agency that comes in and says, you can't publish this. It just doesn't get published. And that has to do with the fact that there's sort of a pack mentality in the United States in terms of media. So if a major outlet like the New York Times or maybe the Washington Post covers a story, or the Guardian or Glenn Greenwald over there in the UK, then all of a sudden it's appropriate to follow the story. But folks who had been covering government surveillance issues and issues of freedom of the press for the last 2 or 3 years were largely ignored because it just wasn't considered an important story culturally. I think people in the United States need to open their eyes and realize that we have to protect the First Amendment. We have to protect the right to privacy for journalists especially, but for everyone.
Well, Mark, I love you. I'm serious. No, the reason I say that is because you're saying a lot of great stuff, but I have so many questions I can't even keep up. First of all, when you mention our First Amendment, our Constitution is a beautiful document. First Amendment's incredible. No other country in the world has that exactly that way. So how does a country like Finland get so far ahead of us? Are we not, like you said, leaning on, utilizing, and putting into practice fully our First Amendment? Because Finland is the country, according to this list, these Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index for 2013, Finland is the country that most respects media freedom. How is our media freedom not respected in America, in your opinion, compared to what is ranked and looked at as number one, Finland, as an example?
I think you might find that a lot of the countries that are ranked up there towards the top are actually smaller countries. We have, over 300 million in our country, so it's really difficult to get some of the news out. Where in a smaller country like Iceland or Finland, where you have maybe 3 million people or something, the size of a average, state in the U.S., it's much easier for reporters to get access to government agencies and to get access to information that's important to the people's governance. In other words, it helps with the democratic process because people have more access. I think in the United States, there is a difficulty in getting to the upper echelons of power as a reporter, getting those interviews, getting into the White House, press corps. It's kind of an elite class of people who are able to do that. So it limits the number of voices that are able to actually get that information out or get the information from our own elected representatives that we need in terms of our voting preferences. And there's also an issue with, like I said, the lack of the number of reporters that we used to have. There's a lot of bloggers and a lot of people who are out there doing pretty much freelance or free work, but they're not getting paid as much as they used to. So it's harder to make money as a reporter, and that's another issue there. But a lot of it just has to do with access to government officials, access to information.
Mark, when we look at a list like this, what do networks do or should do? What should the American media do? What can be done? Or does this simply say to Americans, you need to look outside the United States, for example, international news sources, or not even international, news sources in those home countries when I've traveled abroad. Does this, in a sense, do you think this World Press Freedom Index, the United States ranking 32nd, will change some of those in America's resources when they're trying to obtain their own news and gather information for world events, or perhaps even, for events here in the United States?
Well, Leslie, you are doing exactly what needs to be done. It has to be brought up by the media itself because we are the watchdog, so we're going to have to watchdog ourselves. And that means if news agencies aren't willing to confront this issue, bring it up, on talk shows and, op-ed opinion discussions of this topic, then it's not going to change. I think we really have to start working directly with organizations like Reporters Without Borders to get the information out to our own news agencies. One of the things that bothered me in the past was that I would see things that would happen to reporters, and sometimes, ABC reporters or AP reporters that I thought was a violation of their freedom of the press, their right to report the news. Unfortunately, the agencies that employed them never seemed to want to follow through. I didn't see any lawsuits or complaints filed. I just saw people saying, it's part of the job. Sometimes you get pepper sprayed indiscriminately at a protest, or you get, shut out of a government, public meeting, or
right.
Things like that happen have to be confronted both by the reporter, but mostly by the agency that employs them.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. Who employs them and who wants to buy and who owns media? We'll be back with Mark Taylor-Canfield right after this. I'm Leslie Marshall.
Leslie Marshall. Real people, real life, real talk. Give her a call now at 888-6-LESLIE. You can listen to Leslie on your iPod or MP3 player. Find out how. Go to lesliemarshallshow.com/members.
And we're back. We are talking about the United States being ranked 32 in the World Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders. And we're talking with a reporter, a journalist independently from Seattle, Mark Taylor-Canfield. He is currently working on a book and writing a book on the history of the Occupy Wall Street movement. On the show before, by the way, you can follow him on Twitter at @MTaylorCanfield. That's CANFIELD. On Facebook, facebook.com/M Taylor Canfield as well. And check out his website, soundcloud.com/Mark-Taylor-Canfield. Mark, thank you for holding. Welcome back. You were talking about the owners of these networks. Talk about that. And you said, the owners of these networks. And I say that because, Mark, I live in Los Angeles, and you probably also know that the Los Angeles Times, part of a huge media conglomerate, is being looked at for purchase by the Koch brothers, who are strongly very different than the Los Angeles Times current bent, which is very, far to the left as, publications go. And they're extremely strong civil libertarians. And there are many people who read the Los Angeles Times, not just in L.A., but, in Southern California especially, who are concerned about what this could mean for the future of the paper. So talk to us about the ownership and the corporations behind these media entities.
Well, there is a danger there, Leslie, and it has to do with politics. Once politics enters media, then you have a different situation. And that situation in Los Angeles, believe me, a lot of reporters and media democracy activists are looking directly at that. You also have Bezos, just bought Amazon. Actually, the owner of Amazon, the founder of Amazon, actually just bought the Washington Post. So there's another example. You've got the Seattle Times here in Seattle, where publisher-owner Frank Blethen actually gave $80,000 in free advertising to the Republican governor's candidate, the candidate for governor this last election. And 100 Seattle Times employees walked out, including the reporting staff, and held a rally and signed a letter saying that journalistic and editorial ethics had been violated. Unfortunately, that didn't become a national story, although I think it should have. And I look back at it from this light, too, which is that it is a political issue, and it has to do with the Federal Communications Commission. Now, I actually testified before the Federal Communications Commission about media consolidation, corporate media consolidation, and we had two members of the commission, Commissioners Copps and Adelstein, who were Democrats, who were on the side of the independent journalists and who were on the side of community broadcasters, who said, no, let's try to at least limit some of this. We don't have the fairness doctrine anymore. That was thrown out. So let's at least keep the ownership, limited so that at least we can get some small community-run stations going. What happened was that I brought up two reports that the FCC itself had commissioned. Corporate media consolidation results in less local news story coverage, and it also limits minority and female ownership of the media. Unfortunately, when I brought those studies up at the hearing and had them in my hands, the Federal Communications Commission claimed that they had no knowledge of these reports. So
amazing. Mark, we're going to have you on for more on this. Just absolutely amazing and very sad. I, as a member of the media, I'm saddened by this, and I'm glad that you joined us to talk about it tonight. Mark Taylor-Canfield, independent journalist from Seattle. He's working on a book about the history of Occupy Wall Street and that movement. The U.S. is ranked 32nd by the World Press, by Reporters Without Borders, among the World Press Freedom Index. Mark, thank you for joining us once again. As I said, follow him on Twitter at @MTaylorCanfield, CANFIELD.